Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for coming, those of you here in the audience, as well as those of you online. Welcome to CSIS and to our discussion today on the future of trilateral cooperation for the U.S. and the Indo-Pacific. My name is Victor Cha. I'm President for Geopolitics and Foreign Policy and Career Chair here at CSIS and Professor at Georgetown University. The term trilateralism can apply to many three-way relationships in the region, but it is particularly connected to the trilateral relationship between the United States and its two major allies, Japan and South Korea. Since the establishment of these two alliances in the 1950s, the United States has always sought stronger trilateral relations as a foundation of security and prosperity in the region. This has not always been easy, given the complicated history between the two allies, as well as the complexities of geopolitics and geoeconomics in the region. The first Trump administration understood the importance of building this trilateral partnership. The Biden administration placed great emphasis on this aspect of alliance diplomacy, culminating, as many of you know, in the August 2023 Camp David summit and the so-called commitment to consult, the closest thing to a trilateral collective declaration among the three countries. But going forward, there are many issues to be concerned about. China's position in the region, North Korea's missiles, tariffs, lots of uncertainty. And so we're going to spend some time talking about these issues today. In June, we will mark the 60th anniversary of Japan-Korea normalization of relations with a conference here at CSIS, so please stay tuned for that. But today we've assembled a fantastic group to talk about the future of trilateral relations with Mike Green, Siddharth Mohandas, and Kristi Gavella. So starting with Mike, we're very happy to have Mike Green joining us here from Sydney. It's kind of a homecoming for Mike this week. He is a professor and CEO of the U.S Studies Center at the University of Sydney. He's also non-resident senior advisor and holds the Kissinger Chair here at CSIS. Again, as many of you know, he was formerly Japan Chair at CSIS and Senior Vice President for Asia, as well as Director of Asian Studies at Georgetown. Served on the George W. Bush NSC as the President's senior most official on Asia. His most recent book is Line of Advantage, Japan's Grand Strategy in the Era of Shinzo Abe, published by Columbia University Press in 2022. Also joining us is Siddharth Mohandas, who is Director for Geopolitical Advisory Business at Lazard and a non-resident senior associate at CSIS in our Geopolitics and Foreign Policy Department. That's a lot of geopolitics in your title. Dr. Mohandas served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Indo-Pacific from 2021 to 2023, where among other agreements he worked on AUKUS and on U.S. Japan-Korea trilateral relations. He was also Deputy Director for Policy Planning at the State Department. And last but certainly not least, this event is also very special for us because it is the first event where we are hosting Dr. Kristi Gavella as CSIS's newest senior advisor and Japan chair in our Geopolitics and Foreign Policy Department. So we are especially happy and gratified to welcome her to the team. Dr. Gavella is Associate Professor of Japanese Politics at the University of Oxford in England and was previously the inaugural director of the Center for Indo-Pacific Affairs and Assistant Professor at the University of Hawaii. And before that, she was Deputy Director of Asia at the German Marshall Fund, where she led the Japan and Korea portfolios. She's also held postdoc appointments at Harvard and was an associate professor at the Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies in Honolulu, Hawaii. So please welcome our panel as we begin the discussion. So thank you all for joining us today. It's really great to be able to have this conversation. I thought where we would start is, aside from the tariff news today, which we can of course get to, I guess for many of us, sort of the biggest event was Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth's first visit to the Indo-Pacific. And I thought maybe we could sort of get an initial reaction from all of you, what you thought about the trip, how do you think it went, anything noteworthy that you would want to point to. Maybe we'll start with Siddharth, since this was kind of the sort of stuff that you were preparing for when you were at OSD Policy. So any thoughts you have on that, Siddharth, to get us started?
No, thanks, Victor, and thank you to all for being here today. I thought it was a solid trip, as Victor said. I was in the business of organizing a lot of these trips in the prior administration. There's a lot of work and a lot of coordination that goes into pulling this off on both sides. And I think this trip was largely successful. If you look at the early days of the administration, I think the U.S.-Japan relationship got off to a very strong start with the visit of Prime Minister Ishiba here to Washington and to the White House. He was certainly one of the first foreign leaders to visit the new administration. And that, by all accounts, was a very successful trip, and again sent all the right messages, particularly in terms of continued alliance cooperation and coordination. Now, subsequent to that, I think there were some bumps along the way. The president actually, in a Oval Office press availability, spoke about the Japan-U.S. Security Treaty and was quite critical of it. And then there's also been a lot of discussion, as Victor noted, related to tariffs, and in particular uncertainty about what the impact of tariffs would be in Tokyo. So I think that there was a bit of foreboding leading into Secretary Hegseth's visit, but I think the trip was largely reassuring. He affirmed the importance of the U.S.-Japan alliance. He emphasized in particular that plans that had been inked under the previous administration to develop a joint operational command were on track and would go ahead. This, of course, had been a topic of considerable debate because there had been some leaks suggesting that the Pentagon may have been having second thoughts about this. So it was really important that he set the record straight on that. And then I think the two sides affirmed continued cooperation on a whole set of defense priorities, including defense production related to missiles, the SM-3 and AMRAAMs, continued exercises in the Southwest Islands, continued posture enhancements by the United States. So I think overall a good trip, a good news story. But as Victor said, you come back to today and people are looking back at the tariff announcements again. So the uncertainty lingers. Mike, your thoughts?
I agree with Siddharth. I think from the Quad Foreign Ministers meeting that Marco Rubio hosted very early to the Ishiba-Trump joint statement to this trip, there's, on defense policy, far more continuity than change from the previous administration, which I think will be reassuring. There's more resourcing at a time when everything in this town seems to be getting the axe. The stopgap funding bill through September increases defense 12%. And although I've not seen it myself, the rumors are that the Pentagon planning documents all shift quite dramatically from Europe and CENTCOM to Asia. Senator Wicker's starting to make noise about that, but there's clearly going to be more, and Secretary Hegseth kind of spotlighted that when he pledged $2 billion for the Northern Marianas for security cooperation. So more resources, continuity. But as Siddharth said, does the president want to do all this? The Marco Rubio, Hegseth, Mike Waltz, Bessent team, I think is actually pretty unified on this strategy. But as we heard in the Oval Office, President Trump, every day is a different theme, so we'll have to see. But I think on the defense side, that'd be very reassuring. The Korea stop, it's understandable that there wasn't a Korea stop because of politics in Seoul. I would have wanted to see a little bit more of a message, a strategic message about the importance of Korea out of the administration, and I didn't, unless I missed it, I didn't really see that. So for me, it's understandable there wasn't a Korea stop, but it just leaves some questions about how this administration is going to think about U.S. forces Korea and Korea.
Great, thanks. Christy, your thoughts on this as well? Anything of note that you picked up with regard to the trip? And then also more broadly, as I said earlier, this is the 60th anniversary. In June, we'll celebrate the 60th anniversary of the normalization of relations between Japan and Korea. And love to get your thoughts on, your perspective on, how far we have come since June 1965, and in particular, what do you think is sort of the next step for this bilateral and trilateral relationship?
Great. So I agree with my colleagues about the trip being very positive. I think I heard from some colleagues in Asia that it was confusingly positive, Hegseth's trip. The region was really braced for bad news, and instead they heard many of the same themes that they heard from the previous administration, reassurances. I was also tracking closely the developments in Japan with the affirmation of moving forward with upgrading the alliance structure there. I thought the trip to the Philippines was also very positive and reassuring. Also, the stop in the Federated States of Micronesia was very interesting, and the importance of the second island chain, so really thinking strategically across the region. I think Pacific Islands has been a key strategic region for the previous administration and remains one, and that many countries there are wondering if U.S. attention is going to be changing, and we're again, encouraged. So I think that overall it was positive, but as has been mentioned, it's not clear how these different factors link up. It's clear that within the administration there are many different factions who have various priorities, and it's not clear whether, for example, economics and security and other kinds of policy issues are intended to link up, or actually if it's just fine if they run in opposite directions. And that's something that I think it's very confusing for especially allies and partners in Asia to deal with, because all of them are highly integrated and interested in economics as much as they are in the security of the region. So I think that everyone will still be watching and waiting and wondering if this week will bring different news, or if indeed they will be reassured again. On the question about Japan-South Korea relations and where they've come since 1965, on the positive side, I think it would be easy to say that things have changed so much for the positive amongst Japan and Korea. In 1965, the normalization of relations was extremely controversial. It did not have buy-in from the public. Today, they are strong trade partners. They're strong tourism destinations for one another. Despite the challenges that they face, it's not like it was in the 1960s. But at the same time, a lot of the issues that were not resolved in the 60s have remained and haunted the relationship in many ways. So we see, perennial discussion of historical issues, territorial dispute, et cetera. And so, we tend to see these cyclical sort of back and forth with the Japan-Korea relations. The most strong cycle, I think, has been the one over the last few years, where they were in a really cold period from 2019 to 2022, and then really a wonderful period of cooperation and re-engagement from 2022 until the last year into the present. So I think that it's been really interesting to watch. I think that some of this cyclical pattern just reflects the fact that there are a lot of complex issues in Japan-South Korea relations, and it's impossible to kind of take the good without also recognizing the bad and trying to cope with those. And also different actors have different investments in these, so we partly see the push and pull of domestic politics reflected. But I think going forward, there's a lot to build on.
So, Mike, picking up there, when you sort of look at this relationship over the past 60 years, we've been studying this relationship for a long time. I think we first met each other in a conference about Japan-Korea relations long ago when you were at CFR. What do you think, so Christy talked about these cycles that we've gone through, and the last one being perhaps the most exaggerated cycle, right? Going from a really low point in 2019 to sort of this high point in 2022. Are we just destined to have these cycles? What are the drivers of these things? Or are we going to be sort of at a point now where it'll pretty much kind of move in one direction, with ebbs and flows, but still move sort of at this higher level of cooperation?
I think it's going to be cyclical to some extent, but the larger structure of geopolitics is going to determine how extreme those cycles are. And the current trilateral dynamic is very heavily shaped by what China's doing. So when you and I started doing this in the 90s, it was almost entirely about North Korea. Yeah. And we were earlier talking about when Bill Perry became the special envoy on North Korea, he had a gathering of experts, and Professor Cha and I were younger, a lot younger. We were the youngest guys in the room. I think Scott was there as well. And all the high and mighty Asia experts were giving advice, and then Professor Cha said, you know, Mr. Secretary, if you want to get a handle on the North Korea problem, you're not going to have an easy time convincing North Korea, but the one thing you can really shape is Japan-Korea-U.S. Trilateral, which will be a real asset. And the senior Asia hands all unloaded on Victor Cha, and I sat there watching this thinking, do I just let him take it? And I thought, nah, I ought to help him out. He seems like a good guy. So I said, no, trilateralism is really important. It gives us purchase on the North Korea problem. I said it also gives us leverage vis-a-vis China, because China doesn't want to see bilateral alliances come together. But it was controversial then, and I think now it's got broad support. Now, the reason it's going to be probably less. So the election in Korea could have a big impact on this. But in polls now in Korea, the views towards China and the U.S. are very close to the views in Japan. So in some polls, 90% support for the alliance with the U.S. and Japan and Korea, and somewhere between 80 and 90% alarm at China in both countries. So that threat perception because of China is converging. We did a survey with CSIS Japan chair before you arrived and my center, where we surveyed a couple hundred defense experts in the U.S., Japan, and Australia. And one of the questions was, how important is trilateral cooperation for Japan's security? And over 90% of the Japanese experts said it's important or very important. So I think we're in a different place. There's more of a floor under it. There's more of an external challenge. The Chinese, the PLA very helpfully did live fire exercises in the Yellow Sea about the same time they did a circumnavigation of Australia, about the same time that they squeezed Taiwan and did exercises in between Guam and Japan. So Beijing is signaling and preparing for a theater-wide campaign that Korea can't get out of. And I think that also is going to be pressured. But the domestic politics are complicated. And we'll have to see what happens in Korean politics and Japanese politics too, because of course Japan has upper house election and LDP leadership race, and that's always a wild card in a bilateral relationship.
Yeah. But thus far, the Ishiba's support for trilateralism seems to be quite pronounced, from what I can tell.
Ishiba supports it, and I think within the Gaimusho, the foreign ministry, within the National Security Council in Japan, in academia, there's a much broader consensus. When Moon Jae-in reversed Park Geun-hye's agreement on comfort women, my rough estimate would be about half of Japanese experts thought it wasn't worth trying with Korea. It was just such a backlash. Now I think there's a 90% in our survey of experts. I think there's a broader recognition that for Japan's own national security, they've got to get this right. There's some in Japanese politics who are different, but I don't think any of them are likely to replace Ishiba. So I think in Japan, the political situation is a little bit more promising. Korea's the one where we're just not sure. I'd say Lee Jae-myung's view of this is quite different than Yoon's was, to put it mildly. So we'll have to see.
Yeah. I mean, I think I'll just say that in the Korean case, and I mean, Christy, you could comment on this as well. So we'll have a decision this Friday, right? Thursday evening our time. In terms of what the Constitutional Court's going to decide. If Yoon gets ousted and Lee Jae-myung is the favored candidate from the progressive side, it's interesting. He's kind of actually tried to tack much more. In Korea, they call it right-clicking. Right? He's kind of tacked more to the center as he prepares for a general election. And he did, I think, at least 3 or 4 interviews with Western press, in which he was very explicit about like Japan-Korea relations, trilateralism. Whether it's people like our friend Wee Sung-lak who is advising him, you have to say these sorts of things, or whether that's actually what he believes, are like 2 completely different and unanswerable questions at this point. But I think the external environment, as you say, is really kind of pushing these 2 countries in this direction now. Christy, I don't know if you used to do some Korea too at GMF. I don't know if there's something that you wanted to add to that, but that's.
Well, I agree with all of what's been said. I would just add more on the kind of public opinion end, I think public opinion has also been warming between the two countries over the last couple of years. And so I think one of the challenges with Japan-South Korea relations is that we've found that when bargains and deals are very elite-led, then they tend to fall apart because they don't have that broader buy-in. And I do think that over the last couple of years, the warming of relations has helped to create more positive attitudes, and that some of the people-to-people ties have fostered or re-engaged some of the exchange that really went dormant. So I think all in all, a lot of that work will improve the conditions moving forward, not just at the elite level, but also in kind of the broader-based societal stakeholders of the relationship.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important looking forward.
Yeah.
The other variable that matters, as Siddharth knows well, is the U.S. role.
Yeah.
And U.S. agency. And done in a very overbearing way, it's counterproductive. But people in Siddharth's position, or the jobs we had, behind the scenes can be an important factor too. And I think, Siddharth, you'd know better, but I think Indo-PACOM, U.S. Forces Korea, the Pentagon generally, is now actually, this may be too strong, but becoming dependent on trilateral defense and security cooperation to deal with North Korea and China. So a lot of reason for the U.S. government, I'm not sure about the president, but the U.S. government to weigh in and keep the momentum going, I would think.
Yeah. So I want to go to Siddharthan, but I think that's right, and I think particularly on this point, Christy, about sort of the sort of broader societal support. I mean, people don't remember this, but it's important to remember that Moon Jae-in, after he trashed the Comfort Women Agreement, at the end of his term, sort of reinstated Korea's commitment to it. Like, people didn't pay much attention, but he reinstated it because he understood that it was probably not a good idea to walk away from something like that. But moving over to Siddharth, I mean, maybe you could talk a little bit about, from your perch when you were at OSC Policy working these issues, the point that Mike made about how important Japan and Korea are as military partners in many different contingencies in the region, and how you were all thinking about that as you built up to Camp David, and then I know you did a lot after Camp David, implementing a lot of the work that had been done. So,
no, sure. Look, I think first of all, I agree with you that sort of Camp David, I think, was a watershed moment in the development of trilateral cooperation, and one that we put a lot of work into. And that reflects a couple things. I mean, one is this underlying recognition of the strategic importance of U.S. Japan-Korea cooperation for our security objectives. When you talk about this goal now over 3 administrations of a free and open Indo-Pacific, that's something that you cannot achieve without close cooperation between the United States, Japan, and Korea. These are 2 of our most like-minded partners, 2 of our most capable partners, and working together we can shape a security environment in Northeast Asia, but the Indo-Pacific really more broadly, that is not just free and open, but also secure, prosperous, resilient, all of the things that we want to do. And I think that there's a recognition very much so of that in the U.S. government, but as Mike and Christy have noted, increasingly in allied capitals in Tokyo and Seoul as well. I think the specific achievement, at Camp David was to go beyond the sort of exhortations to solidarity, which had been a mainstay of these types of summits for years past, and really define a comprehensive and concrete program of action that had its own rhythm and architecture, and the hope was its own momentum that could survive the vicissitudes of domestic politics in all 3 countries. And we're going to put that to the test because, potentially as soon as Friday, we'll have completed governmental changes in all 3 countries, and so we'll see. But when you tried to define these specifics of sharing of early warning missile data, increased exercises, a named annual multi-domain exercise, supply chain cooperation, all of the things that were rolled out at Camp David, it was the fundamental goal is to demonstrate the value of this cooperation for each of these countries' security, and in that respect become self-sustaining. And so I think we've made a lot of progress, but to Mike's point, it's going to depend on continued sort of engagement by all 3 capitals. And again, we've seen positive indications out of out of Tokyo and Seoul, but the peace in Washington is going to be critical as well.
So in that respect, let me ask you the question that I always hate to answer when I'm being asked the question is, so now let's talk about the current administration and the road going forward. If you were NSA Waltz or Secretary Rubio, what would be the advice you'd be giving to the president on trilateralism, trilateral cooperation?
So I would say a few things. I mean, I think the first thing I would say is look for concrete wins. Don't try and kind of revise the relationship sort of fundamentally or boil the ocean in terms of trying to do everything at once. Try and identify specific items that these three countries working together can actually advance the agenda that you've articulated. And what the administration has articulated is a focus on China competition, increased focus on homeland defense, and having allies do more and share more of the burden for defense in the Indo-Pacific. Trilateralism can be part of all of that. If you're looking at homeland defense, for instance, theater missile defense integrated with ground-based mid-course defense to defend the homeland is going to be essential. And so building on what we have already done trilaterally is a way forward. I think there are ways you could identify new areas of cooperation, for instance, related to AI, given both countries' strength in the semiconductor industry. So I think that could be a new area of cooperation. And then just more generally, if you're talking about strengthening the security environment, strengthening deterrence in the Indo-Pacific, what you want is a high degree of interoperability and even integration between Japan, Korea, and the United States. So deepening our military activities together, seeking to potentially expand them, maybe bring in Australia. Those are all wins that I think are on the table. My other two sort of pieces of advice would just be to note that you have a trade agenda, and this is a point Christy made as well, but you also have a security agenda, and they don't at the moment appear to be lashed up. And so, we'll see what the tariff announcements look like this afternoon. To the extent that they are impacting Japan and South Korea, try and get them into a process so that they don't take over the relationship and that you can still have meaningful forward momentum on the security relationship. And then my last piece of advice would just be to remember these countries have domestic politics too. And they have domestic constituencies that they have to be attentive to. And so as you're asking more of them, which I think we are very well entitled to do, you have to understand that they've got to work this through their own political systems. And you have to keep that in mind as you make demands.
Christy, thoughts?
So I think I would keep my points fairly high level. One is that I would say that U.S. Japan, South Korea trilateralism is a tool that really is essential to many key U.S. interests and objectives, and that it can be used for many purposes, but that the relationships themselves should be strengthened and maintained for the greater interests of the U.S. So that's the first point I would make. Second, I would echo Siddharth's point about making the policies more holistic, thinking about how trade and security link up. And in some cases, those might actually offer bargaining leverage for the U.S., but just thinking about how this is part of a multi-issue negotiation with these countries and the impacts that one area has for another, and where contributions in one area maybe could add towards their contributions or compensate for a perceived lack of contribution in another. So there are opportunities in thinking of things a more broad-based way. And the last thing I would say is that this is not a one-shot game. This is a repeated game that you're playing with these allies and partners, by which I mean that it's not just about the negotiation that we have today about a specific issue. This is about a long-term relationship in which maybe today we don't win quite as much, but tomorrow we could, have a better deal that would actually get all parties, further towards their mutual goals. So I think right now we're playing a lot of one-shot games on different issues, and it's really hard to find that coherence in the agenda. But actually, if we're trying to think strategically about the interests of the U.S. and these other countries, we want to think about it in a more holistic and sort of time-oriented way.
Great, thanks. Mike, your thoughts on that? And then also I'd like to ask you also to start on this question of how is Japan, the Ishiba government, looking at this I guess here it's kind of referred to as Crink, but this idea, this cohering of China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. So first, your advice to NSA Waltz, besides staying off Signal, your advice to NSA Waltz
I was going to send him my advice on Signal. So I would not push for a trilateral summit. They're useful, but they're not necessary, and I'm not sure in this administration that's the way to go. I would push for institutionalization of what the Camp David vision put forward, and that's something that can be done by Secretary Rubio, Hegseth, and by Mike Waltz, and I think my sense is they actually are on side. And of course Indo-PACOM and U.S. Forces Korea. So institutionalization. And then the other thing is I would look to plug this trilateral and Korea in particular into the broader range of minilaterals that are now becoming important tools, not just for the U.S., but for Australia, for Japan. So under President Yoon, Korea issued an Indo-Pacific strategy and was beginning to start playing more of a role in the Pacific Islands, in Korea, and infrastructure financing. For a long time, Korean embassies in countries like Sri Lanka or Cambodia were not in the room with the U.S., Japan, Australia, Britain, and the Five Eyes strategizing how to shore up resilience, do infrastructure financing. Korea provided patrol boats to Vietnam. So did the U.S., Japan, Australia. The U.S., Japanese, and Australian ambassadors didn't know Korea was doing it. So President Yoon started to really change that so that Korea was a part of the team. And I think that's really important because Korea brings soft power, it brings capabilities, it brings technology, it brings development assistance and democracy support, a really good toolkit. And so I would look to sort of not limit it to the trilateral security things that came out of Camp David, but really get Korea into the Squad, which is the U.S., Japan, Australia support for the Philippines, help with the Pacific Islands. U.S. provides 7% of development assistance in the Pacific Islands. It now provides, that's 7% that's missing for the foreseeable future. Korea can contribute a lot. So I would broaden the geographic scope and the toolkit. And this is because I live in Australia now. This is something the Australian side really wants from Korea and needs. And then we touched on it briefly, but defense production. U.S. has 1% of shipbuilding. Of our democratic allies, Korea is the strongest shipbuilder. Japan's second strongest. So it's not just about diplomacy, defense. It's about our capacity to have deterrence in the first place. Yeah. And Ishiba, I'm jet lagged. What was
on this? How is Japan looking at this? China, Iran, North Korea, Russia.
Crink. Yeah. So you all are familiar, I'm sure, with the IP4, the Australia, Japan, Korea, New Zealand summit level and other participation in NATO. And our center with CSIS will be doing more on the IP4. The Japan under Abe was instrumental in holding together the G7 in the first Trump administration because the transatlantic friction was not as bad as it is today, but it wasn't good. And in the G7, Prime Minister Abe really put enormous effort into holding together the G7. I think Ishiba is going to need help this time. And the IP4, which includes Korea, I think could become very important because the Crink team is getting closer. The Russians are helping Houthis target shipping, but not Chinese shipping. Russia and China are enabling North Korea's provocations, and so on and so forth. This is not the time for Europe, the Euro-Atlantic alliances, and the Indo-Pacific alliances to be fractured. I think in Washington, most people know that, but it's fractured. So I think part of the logic, to the extent there is logic to this in Washington, is we need to focus on Asia and China. And who better to explain why we need Europe than Japan, Korea, Australia, and New Zealand? So I think on the global stage, Ishiba is going to need help. And I think Korea is positioned to do that, and Australia and New Zealand as well. I don't see any evidence that any of our allies in Asia, and I travel to Japan and Korea all the time, are doing a plan B. Everything they're going to be about is holding together the alliance network, and we're going to need it. And we're going to need not just Abe this time, we're going to need Korea and Australia as well.
Yeah. Christy, your thoughts on the Crink? It's a terrible acronym, but the China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and the bad guys, and how Japan is thinking about it.
I think there's definitely rising concern about the interconnections between all of these countries. I think also a lot of uncertainty about what exactly is happening. I think that this is basically driving the desire, as Mike was saying, to continue with bridging these alliances and partnerships across regions. But I think also a concern that I hear from many colleagues is that the amount of concern that they have for each of these countries differs, and then within their concerns about these countries, the priority they give them differs. So, for example, with respect to North Korea, the abductee issue is high on the priorities of the Japanese government, but it may not be as much of a concern to others. So, and with respect to Russia, that's much more of a prescient issue for Europe, and Japan does care too, but the way they view that is a little bit different. So I think that there is a high degree of concern and awareness, but there's also a lot of consideration about what exactly the details of cooperation would look like and how the different partners can best leverage their strengths in a very complex situation.
Yeah. Siddharth, what are your thoughts on this?
A couple observations. I think, the first thing to note about this, maybe this fearsome foursome, I'll call it, is
there are
that
many different names.
the three of them are neighbors of Japan and Korea. And so in that sense, of any countries in the world that would most acutely face a threat, it's Seoul and Tokyo. And again, I think these countries have leaned into that in ways that underscore the threat. So you've seen China and Russia engage in joint heavy bomber patrols that entered both the Japanese and Korean ADIZs late last year. I think that underscores the nature of this coordination, the nature of the threat. Obviously, there have been very concerning reports about advanced technology being funneled sort of in return to North Korea by the Russians that could potentially be increasing the capability of their missile program. Again, that's a concern for both Japan and Korea. One particular observation I would make is that of all four of these countries, I think the country that's done best in this coalition of the Crinks is actually North Korea. They've now have more leverage and more room for maneuver vis-a-vis China, whereas otherwise they were sort of almost entirely dependent on the Chinese. They now are able to draw on the Russians, and they're feeling good about their security situation on the peninsula, and therefore I think that makes them potentially risk acceptance. So I do think that's a danger. I think just the last thing I would say is, fundamentally, what do these countries want? They want to sort of engage in aggressive revisionist actions in their neighborhoods, particularly in Northeast Asia. The main obstacle they perceive to that is the United States and its allies. And so what they are fundamentally seeking to do is drive wedges between the United States and its closest allies. And so we should not let them. That, I think, is the most important thing.
That's interesting. On your North Korea point, I would agree. I think, we can ask the Kissinger chair this thing. I think if there's anything we learned from Henry Kissinger, it's that the best place to be is to occupy the pivot position between your two competitors. And North Korea clearly occupies that position between Russia and China today, in large part because of the war in Ukraine, which has really benefited them. We're going to go to questions in a minute, but let me turn the discussion in a different direction. All of you have touched on it already, but it's today is a big day, I guess you could say, in Washington, D.C. when it comes to talk about tariffs. I think it would be a surprise if we found out that these so-called reciprocal tariffs are not going to impact U.S. allies and partners. I think we'd all be surprised if that were the case. How, all of you work on our alliance relationships in Asia. How would you advise our allies to be thinking about this? I think all of you mentioned the disconnect between this very pro-alliance supportive message by the Pentagon going out to the region, and yet today we may see things that make U.S. allies look like trade adversaries. So, like, how do you square that circle in your mind? How would you talk about it to allies and partners that want to work with the United States? Christy.
Well, it's a challenging situation, and we don't know exactly what's coming down the pipeline yet. But I think that one thing I would tell allies in Asia is that, right now there is a disconnect between the trade policy and other issues. So the existence or the imposition of tariffs does not necessarily mean that the U.S. does not believe in its alliances or that it is determined to abandon these old relationships. But instead, this is really something that is being driven by domestic politics, economic concerns, and other things. But that it is compatible with long-standing dedication to security relationships. The second thing I would say is that this is clearly a very dynamic situation. So even if the announcement today is possibly among the worst of scenarios, surely it will be changing in the weeks and months to come, and that we have seen that there is a lot of room for agency and creativity in these situations as different countries come up with different solutions to meet the demands of the U.S. in different ways. And so this is not necessarily, again, a permanent or lasting thing, but something that should be viewed in the longer arc of their relationships with the U.S. So I think that's kind of where I would start.
Mike.
First, according to the New York Times, Donald Trump has been in more than 4,000 lawsuits, and he's lost 90% and he's settled the rest. So, of course, he's going to come out swinging. You don't have to panic. Second, you don't have to be more outraged than the American public is. Before the market crashed the first time 2 weeks ago, 60% of Americans opposed tariffs. The public clearly knows it causes inflation. The number one reason most analysts think President Trump won was inflation. And so you don't have to be more outraged than the American public. There's going to be a self-inflicted political and economic wound from this. Number three, you can play footsie with China, and you can, Japan and Korea are talking about, convening the CJK Trilateral again. I don't think that's going to really have much impact on Washington. But doing more with each other, Japan, Korea, Australia, will have an influence. And I hope our allies do coordinate how they handle it. I know they are, how they handle this. I don't think, it's a weird world we're in. The defense collaboration is going to grow. And the trade friction's not going to stop it, because China is scarier. And again, I don't see any of our allies' defense departments or defense ministries divesting from the alliance with the U.S. It would take, these are countries like Korea, Japan, Australia, we're talking 70, 80 years of investments in defense capability premised on an alliance with the U.S. It would take, 10, 20 years to retool. That's way past the Trump administration. So I don't see any evidence that they're retooling. Quite the opposite. And in part because of the Hegseth trip and because defense resources from the U.S. are flowing to the Indo-Pacific. The hard part, and could be very hard, is what the Australians call social license. So we're doing hard, and Saurath knows better than anyone, we're doing hard things together. AUKUS is big and ambitious and complicated. Force posture, getting Marines training in the Southwest Islands of Japan, Japanese and Korean and Americans training in the Northern Territories. These are local communities. So the stuff we're doing is important, but it takes public support. And so I don't think defense departments or ministries are going to divest from the U.S., but the stuff we need to do could get a lot harder politically. It depends on the tariffs. Depends on what depends on what they're aimed at. If to give you one example, if the tariffs are used to try to open Japan's rice market, stop the Australian ban on kids doing social media, or force countries to accept, U.S. demands for drug pricing, that's going to touch every Australian, every Japanese in a very personal way. That would be much worse than a sort of one-off tariff, that then is in place and, the market knows it's there. So what happens at 4 o'clock today will matter, because it could be quite different. Yeah. Nobody's going to divest from the alliance with the U.S., but stuff we need to do, stuff that Arth worked on, is going to get harder. It's going to be harder to get the social license, the support.
Yeah. Siddharth.
So look, I think an important theme that all three of us have hit on here is the dynamism of this. Whatever's announced this afternoon in terms of tariffs will not be the last word. I'm fairly confident of that. And so what that means is that, allied countries in consultation with the United States will have cards to play in a negotiation. And again, the administration has been fairly explicit that a lot of this is meant as table setting for a negotiation. So even as there are trade actions against adversaries, there are also going to be trade actions and have been trade actions aimed against China. There is deep concern about Chinese overcapacity, so coordinating with allies is going to be a big part of addressing that problem. Related to that, there is ongoing technology competition with China in semiconductors, but potentially other areas. The administration has gestured at biotechnology, of dual-use technologies related to aerospace. All of that's actually going to require your advanced technology partners like Japan, like Korea, if you're going to be effective. That's going to be, I think, an important part of the discussion. These countries are trying to diversify their energy resources, and so looking at LNG purchases is an option. And they're both investing more in defense, and again, that I think can be part of the discussion. So I think sort of on one level, broadening the sort of scope of issues that are discussed in the context of alleviating the tariffs actually will make it much more likely to have a productive outcome. But my second piece of advice would be kind of the opposite of that, which is don't let this define the relationship. Try and get it into a process, as I said earlier, so that you can still have the security discussions on their own terms and continue to make progress there.
Great. I think very good advice from all three. So we do have some time for questions. If we could ask folks to raise their hands and identify themselves. Are we taking questions online too, or we're not taking questions online? Okay, so we're just doing in the audience. So we'll go right here.
Hi, thank you so much for speaking today. I'm Keisuke Wada, Georgetown School of Foreign Service Asian Studies master's student, and currently interning at the Wilson Center in the Pacific Program and the JITRO. The panelists have already touched upon this already, but I want to ask more on the Ishiba administration's policy or attitude toward China. Like some of the people have been saying Ishiba's diplomatic attitude toward China, like they are still slightly leaning toward China, but if I want to ask the panelists if this assumption is true, and then if so, other two actors in the trilateral relations, Korea, U.S., how they are seeing this kind of trend or not? Yeah.
Great. Christy, do you want to start?
Sure. So it's not my feeling that the Ishiba administration or Ishiba himself are strongly leaning towards China. I mean, I think it's a complex, evolving situation, but I think it's been pretty clear in the sense that so many Japanese policies are aimed at reaffirming and strengthening the U.S. Japan alliance, and so much of the attention is focused there. It's true that there have been some meetings, perhaps less than people actually thought there would be, though, actually, when Ishiba came into office. And of course, Japan and China are very highly interdependent trade partners, so there is an interest in stabilizing things. But in the content of those meetings, I don't think that you see any really big substance. A lot of this is pretty basic reaffirmation of principles or things that have been ongoing for some time. So I don't think in that sense it's really a new step or anything substantive in comparison to the attention that's been focused on the U.S. over the past several months.
Mike, you want to add anything?
So, 3 years ago, the ruling Liberal Democratic Party's National Security Commission put out a really revolutionary security strategy. 2% of GDP defense, strike weapons, the most hawkish thing out of the LDP ever. But the whole strategy began with the statement, our objective is a more productive relationship with China. So I don't think there's any contradiction between arming to the teeth to deter China, strengthening the Quad, and also going for reassurance and dialogue. I mean, that's basic. I don't know if it is there anymore, but it used to be in the Defense Department's policy wing. They had in big letters, maybe you guys painted over it, deter, defeat, dissuade, deter, defeat, reassure. So part of deterrence, part of defense strategy also includes reassurance, right? So to me, there's no contradiction at all. And as Kirsty said, there's nothing really new. It's it's smart strategy.
Yeah, I'll be brief. I mean, I agree with both Christy and Mike. I think there may be sort of ups and downs and closeness or distance in the Japan-China relationship, but I do agree that 2022 was sort of a watershed moment in terms of articulating a Japanese view of the security environment, specifically vis-a-vis China, and the importance of Japan being able to deter and defend against potential threats from China.
Yeah, and the only thing I'd add to that is I feel that of all the countries in the region, Japan probably has the most well-nuanced policy and strategy vis-a-vis China. We don't tend to be very nuanced here in Washington, D.C., but Japan is very sort of nuanced in how it does it. And so sometimes you see certain signals are a little bit stronger, maybe from a new administration coming in, trying to distinguish itself from the past. But in the end, it always kind of ends up in a very similar place. So, yes.
Hello, I'm Ken Moriyasu from Nikkei Asia. Dr. Green said something very interesting about moving the money from CENTCOM to Indo-PACOM. And I think the administration has said that their core interest is to prevent Chinese hegemony. My question is, from here, is that synonymous with defending Taiwan? Has the U.S., do you sense that the strategic line of defense for the Trump administration has shifted from the Biden years? Is Taiwan included? Is South Korea even included? I have a feeling that the omission of South Korea from Hegseth's strip is not a coincidence. And I feel that the Trump administration sees the Philippines and Japan as the two key partners in a Taiwan operation, and maybe seeing South Korea in a different role, maybe to defend off North Korea while Philippines and Japan fight off China. What are your thoughts about the strategic line of defense? Thank you.
So this debate about where the line of defense is very old in U.S. strategy. It's not the first time that Washington has questioned whether Korea is in our defensive line or not. You know, Secretary of State Acheson said in January 1950 it's not, and Pyongyang, Moscow, and Beijing read the press report and 6 months later attacked South Korea. So there are consequences of getting it wrong. I don't think there's any consensus on this in the administration. I think there is you have to separate President Trump. You hear these arguments, President Trump believes in spheres of influence, or he believes, I don't think there's a strategy. Strategy is ends, ways, and means. I don't think he's about ends, he's about ways, getting leverage, dominating the news cycle, but not sort of where all this leads, in my view. But I do think among the other parts of the administration, there is more of a strategic set of assumptions, and they overlap on the importance of Japan, Australia, and the Philippines, as you say, and India, and the Quad, and the maritime domain. They overlap on that. They do not overlap on Korea, in my view. I think there will be big debates in this administration about whether Korea fits in the defensive line or not, or whether Korea is relevant for strategic competition with China. I think at the leadership level, the majority view is Europe is not relevant. So I think that's very wrong. NATO may not send 20 frigates to a Taiwan crisis, but the economic dependence China has on Europe is massive. So Europe brings a lot to the table in terms of deterrence and dissuasion. I think it's a mistake to think Korea's optional. Korea may not be able to free up forces from the Korean Peninsula, but the Korean Peninsula for 2,000 years has been the center of geopolitical competition in North Asia. You don't just write that off. So I think the people in the administration who think Europe doesn't matter or Korea may be optional are wrong, but I don't think there's a consensus. And this goes back to Japan, by the way. In previous periods where the Carter administration or President Trump in 2018, when the U.S. has flirted with pulling off the Korean Peninsula, Japan's intervention was incredibly important. Incredibly important. So I hope Ishiba-san is up for that. My sense was in his summit, he was mostly focused on bilateral things and getting assurance on the Senkakus. But that's not how Abe approached it. Abe looked at G7, he looked at Korean Peninsula, and he realized he had more leverage than most leaders with President Trump, and he used it. So anyway, I don't think there's a consensus. I think that the Korea will be a debate, and you'll read about it right here with the Korea chair.
Any others? Okay, next.
You agree?
Let's go in the back here. Yes.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much. My name is Hyunwoo Roh from Sumitomo Corporation, an analyst there, and also a second-year grad student at Johns Hopkins CSIS. I think when you look at the Biden administration and the Trump administration, and you compare it, I think there's a very funny irony here. This presence of the United States as a common ally has brought together these three countries for the Camp David summit. And obviously, it looks like it's, for all three countries, it's a great-to-have situation. But on the other hand, if you have Donald Trump, although the chances of this trilateral summit, like Dr. Green mentioned, is decreasing, I believe there's this additional pressure for Japan and South Korea to not necessarily just to have a great to have situation, but also be forced to really work together. Obviously, Trump is putting pressure on both Japan and South Korea in terms of trade. They've discussed the costs of military bases, and there's always been talks of withdrawing troops from South Korea, maybe Japan as well. I believe that potentially the lack of presence of the United States has the potential to bring those two countries together. What do you think is the tipping point for the United States for Japan and South Korea to actually have to be forced to work together and move towards maybe trilateral cooperation in that sense? Thank you.
That's to any one of our panelists, I assume, right?
Or I can kick off. I mean, look, I don't think, I think a theme of what we've been talking about the past hour is that much of this cooperation has actually been achieved with the United States. And it's important that the United States doesn't necessarily have to be out in front and driving it. But the United States, certainly over the last several decades, has played a critical role behind the scenes in bringing these countries closer together. Now, at a time when I think there's maybe a degree of uncertainty about U.S. foreign policy, both vis-a-vis trade and sort of the overall strategic posture, I think that actually underscores how important this type of cooperation is, both bilaterally and trilaterally. And then you layer on top of that a sort of generational challenge from China in terms of its military modernization, as well as its economic policies, and particularly export of overcapacity, as I mentioned. When you weigh all of that together, I think it is an inescapable conclusion for both Seoul and Tokyo that they have far more in common than separates them, and that they need to take advantage of what they have in common.
So I live in Australia, and the important part of the Australian strategy for managing the uncertainty in Washington is to deepen cooperation with Japan. Very clear. The important part for Japan's strategy is to deepen cooperation with Australia. I don't think that's happening between Japan and Korea in the same way, but for the reasons Siddharth said, it should. It'd be good for both Japan and Korea, it'd be good for the US. I've been in a lot of trilaterals in my career, US, Japan, Korea, TCOG, US, Japan, Australia, and everybody thinks that we get in the room and we pull out a big map and we're going to decide how we're going to get China or North Korea. But actually, as Victor knows well and Siddharth knows, most of those trilateral discussions are our two Asian allies telling us to get our act together. It's gaiatsu, it's external pressure. Am I allowed to tell people that? So trilateralism exerts an important influence on American debates as well. And just as Japan and Australia are doing more together, once Korean politics settle, it would be good for Korea to be in that mix as well.
Christy?
So I think it's positive that U.S. allies and partners are cooperating more, regardless of what the U.S. is doing. I think in the end, this is going to serve everyone's interests quite productively. On your question about tipping points, I think that it may vary on an issue-to-issue basis. I mean, we're seeing a lot of different policies rolling out. I think that countries are going to look at what's happening, and all of them have limited resources and time, and they're going to look at the ones that they prioritize and the areas where they can step up in some ways to demonstrate leadership, and and maybe in others they have to kind of pass the buck. And so I think it might not be as simple as just saying like, well, the U.S. will do X, and then everyone will realize that this is the moment to cooperate. I think it'll be much more dynamic and much messier than that as all of these different changes happen. I mean, we saw this with the U.S. Withdrawal from the TPP and then the creation of the CPTPP. I mean, as these things happen, I think we'll see different countries get together, and in some cases, Japan and Korea may find themselves, perhaps as part of a broader coalition, acting to really push some policies forward, whether the U.S. is involved or not.
So clearly, I'm sorry, we're out of time, but clearly it's a very fluid situation. But we've seen some good early signals by the Trump administration, particularly with this first trip to Asia, and by Marco Rubio and the Quad meetings initially. But still, there's a lot more to discuss, and this won't be the last time that we'll be all coming together as a group to look at the future of trilateralism. So thank you all for joining us today, and thank you to our expert speakers.